Welcome to the Center of Everywhere podcast, where we explore stories of rural Minnesotans who are making a difference in their communities. Rural isn't in the middle of nowhere. It is in the center of everywhere.
And here we are at episode 2. I'm Marnie Werner, and I'm the Vice President of Research at the Minnesota Center for Rural Policy and Development. And I'm going to be tag teaming today on the hosting duties with our President and CEO, Julie Tesh. And since this is just episode 2, why don't you tell listeners what we do at the center?
Sure. The Center for Rural Policy and Development is a 501c3, so we're our own nonprofit. But what we were started to do in 1997 was to research issues that are vital to rural Minnesota. So issues that are important in metro areas are also important to rural areas as well. So if you think about healthcare, you think about childcare, those things are all important in rural areas. And what we do is put a rural lens on those issues. And so we know that different parts of the state have different issues and different ways of looking at things, and that's what we do. And then we also take that back to the legislature. And so what our research does is inform, hopefully, good policy. And so we're non-biased, non-partisan, and trying to get that information to decision makers, whether that's at the state level, the county level, township, city level, any decision makers. And all of our research is free for the public to use. And we have a 19-member board that is very active in what we do in our research. And so just really happy to have this organization be working on these issues right now. And then also, we started our podcast back in January and have received some really good comments. And with COVID-19 now, we decided that we needed to respond to that because this is affecting all of America and all of Minnesota, and rural Minnesota has some unique issues and opportunities. And so we wanted to start covering that in this podcast.
Right. And as listeners may have noticed, we're obviously in different places. We're all socially distant, working out of our homes. And so I'm in Mankato. Julie's out by Waldorf, Minnesota. And today we're going to be talking with one of our board members, Sue Grafstrom. She is all the way up in Roseau, Minnesota, up on the border with Canada. And Sue is in the public health field, and she currently serves as both the Roseau County Emergency Manager and the Minnesota Department of Health's Public Health Preparedness Consultant for northwestern Minnesota, which covers 12 counties and 3 tribes. Welcome to the podcast, Sue.
Well, thank you for having me.
Did I get all your titles and everything right?
You got them exactly right. Perfect.
Great. Okay. So, Sue, for those who don't know exactly where Roseau is, why don't you tell us about where you're located and what it's like up there and what makes Roseau a special place?
Well, we are geographically isolated, and so we are 10 miles south of the Canadian border, as you said, so we are very close to Canada. We're about an hour away from the North Dakota border, but then we're about 20 minutes from Lake of the Woods, and most people are familiar with Lake of the Woods because it's a little stovepipe on top of Minnesota. And so we live in an area, like I said, it's very isolated as far as the number of people up here, but as far as recreational things, we have a lot of hunting, fishing, but we also do a lot of manufacturing, agriculture, and that sort of thing. And so we are very self-sufficient when it comes to both our work and our play.
Right. You have Marvin Windows up there, right?
Yep. Marvin Windows is in Warroad. We have Polaris Industries in Roseau. We have what's called Central Boiler in Greenbush, which manufactures zero-turn lawnmowers and also outdoor wood boilers. So there is a lot of manufacturing. And then, of course, there's smaller manufacturing outfits throughout the county that all really support those 3 big industries too. So there's a lot of other work that goes on because of those industries that are here.
Right. Okay. And so what do you do there as a county emergency manager?
So each county across the state of Minnesota has an emergency manager, and we get money from the federal government to have the position. And basically, the county emergency management director is responsible for planning, for trying to mitigate, for responding to, and then recovering from disasters that a county may experience. So in my county, that for the last 10 to 15 years, that has meant a lot of different high water events. People may think of them as floods, but we have a fair amount of flat land. And so we get a lot of overland flooding, whether it's from rain or whether it's from snow melt. And so my job is really to make sure that we are ready if we need to combat some of the flooding problems that happen, to just monitor that. But then if we do have it, I really am a source for the different resources that need to be able to work on that flooding mitigation or responding to it. And so a lot of my job is communication with partners throughout the county for that. Of course, once you have a disaster, well, then you're in the recovery phase after responding to it. And so if you're lucky enough to get money from either FEMA, the federal government, or from the state of Minnesota, there's a fair amount of paperwork in coordination with that. And so this position would do that as well. So when we're not doing any of those things, it's really maintaining plans and maintaining mitigation strategies so that you identify what types of things might be a hazard for your county, and then trying to make plans that would be specific to that. So that's a lot of what the county emergency management director does.
So Sue, I know you have a vast background in public health as well, and that's a big part of another job that you have, being a public health preparedness consultant. What does that job involve?
So that job, actually, if you take emergency management overall, there's two other industries, entities, I would say, that emergency management will touch almost every time you have a disaster. And that's either public health or making sure that the needs of the health needs of the public are being taken care of. But then you also have the hospital and the healthcare response to it. So on the public health side, there are a couple of incidences that will directly affect public health, and we're in one right now. It's a pandemic. If there were such bioterrorism, such as an anthrax poisoning, public health really is the main responder to that incident, where then the county emergency management would support that. But county public health has the lead in that, and much like in a pandemic now. So with the state of Minnesota, they give money that comes from the CDC to plan for these types of events to local public health departments. So my job, working with the 12 counties and the 3 tribes, is to then go and work with each public health department. And every year there's a set of tasks that they have to do and plans that they have to keep up. And so I work with them each year on their plans and making sure that they're getting their work done. It's more of a supportive role. It's not really an oversight role, but helping them to get the work done, to find the different ways to respond, interpret things that might be coming out from the CDC and that sort of thing. So that's the work that I do, which fits so nicely in with the county emergency management, because the two in a response really do work side by side, and especially now with this COVID.
Okay, so is a pandemic the kind of emergency that you would have been preparing for otherwise? Because it just seems like it would be so far down on the list of possibilities of things that would happen in Roseau County. And so how are you dealing with that?
Yeah, and I hear this across both agencies, whether it's emergency management at the state level or whether it is public health. Yes, we're all preparing for disasters, and pandemic is always included in that. But when you put it in the context that the last true pandemic, worldwide pandemic, happened in 1918, planning for one really is difficult because so much has changed in terms of how people live, how healthcare is delivered, the advances in healthcare, all of that. So, so everybody has said, "Wow, we have plans," but nobody really thought pandemic was going to be in our lifetime. Most people thought it was going to happen, but and by most people, I say the experts that I've been reading thought that it was going to happen soon, but not in our lifetime. So preparing for it, yes, we have plans in place. We have a certain amount of communication strategies, support strategies, how to deal with the isolation and quarantine on the public health side. That's one of their roles. If they have somebody, whether they have tuberculosis, Ebola, or COVID-19, there's isolation quarantine they're responsible for. So we have those plans in place, but when everyone is affected all at one time, nobody was prepared for that in particular.
I'm curious about up in northern Minnesota, how it's playing out up there, because I know here in southern Minnesota, it's like a slow moving wave coming in, and we have some cases of COVID-19 down here in Martin County and in a few other counties. But up there, how is it playing out? Are people taking this seriously? What's going on up there?
Yes, so culturally, we are pleasers up in northern Minnesota and specifically Roseau County. So we want to do the right thing. And so we have, even though we do not have to this point in time a diagnosed case of COVID, we are operating under the understanding, and everybody across the county, I would say, is operating under the understanding that it's probably here, so let's keep everybody socially distanced in their homes, away from work if possible. So, but yes, it kind of reminds me of the stories I'd hear of tsunamis, where it's a beautiful sunny day, they're standing on the beach, they've heard this, tsunami might be coming, but they can't even imagine how far and how fast the water will come. I feel like that's where northern Minnesota is at. We know it's coming. We have heard stories of how awful it is, but we just aren't going to be able to imagine it till we're in it. And it's very slow moving. Our county coordinator here in Roseau County was the point person for the flood back in 2002.
Oh, you froze.
Yeah. I'm like, did she freeze or it was just me?
No. Are you there, Sue? Did you get cut off?
Pandemic, we are in response, and we will be in response for quite some time.
Okay, you got kind of cut off there, I think, on your last couple sentences.
Okay.
You want to just go through them again?
Yeah, so in a COVID response, we will be in response for quite a long time, and they're saying months. And that is so unlike anything that you would have as far as a tornado or a flood or a wildfire, because your response is quick and then it's mostly recovery after that. In this case, it will be a very long response, but then it will be hopefully a much shorter period of recovery in terms of getting everybody back to normal.
And we should mention that we're recording this on April 1st, 2020. So we're kind of still right in the middle or right before the middle of this. We're still not really sure what's going to happen, even in the metropolitan areas in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And so, Sue, besides healthcare and the local capacity to care for patients, what's the other kind of planning that you do? What else do you plan for in a response to COVID-19?
So what we are doing a lot of planning with currently is transportation. I'll probably boil it down to transportation, because our healthcare facilities are not high, they don't treat high medically needful people. So most of our ICU patients, I should say all of our ICU patients, are actually transferred out to a regional healthcare center. So that's pretty typical in rural Minnesota. In our case, that would be to Grand Forks, which is about 2 hours away. So in a COVID response, a lot of the discussion right now is about that movement back and forth. We're going to be moving our highest need patients out to Grand Forks at All True Health System as long as they need them. But then in return, All True Health System is going to be moving back patients that are hospitalized that need a lower level of care. And so the logistics of that really is what we're focusing on right now. The other thing that we're also then focusing on is when All True becomes overwhelmed, now we need to ramp up locally, and what that is going to look like. It's our hospital right now making plans to try and treat people as well as they can, given the fact that they don't treat ICU in general. So those are the things that really have been consuming us. And then also just the communication with the different county partners. I run a weekly meeting with what I call our county stakeholders, where we have our business people, we have our city and county leaders, we have our healthcare people, we have our social service people, we have the ministerial association, we have other business like the chambers on board, so that we can all talk about kind of what do we foresee as happening right now. We give a little state of the state, or a state of the county as far as COVID, and then a state of the state as far as COVID. But just to get everybody on the same plane and operating with the same information. So that's been very, very helpful. But in any response, communication is key. You'll hear that over and over. Usually one of the first things to break down. So we're trying to get out ahead of that.
Right. So what kind of, so on the line of communications, what kind of communications do you have with the state and with the state's emergency center, and how's that going?
So both on my public health side and on my emergency management side, we have daily, if not for sure weekly or bi-weekly meetings with both of those, what they call emergency operations centers. So it started first in public health because public health ramped up a lot before the actual state EOC opened up. But since then, I'm getting updates from both of them via conference calls, where there's an opportunity to ask questions, to clarify information that we've heard. In the meantime, of course, then we have smaller meetings with local public health, with local long-term care. I'm actually on a committee that works regionally with healthcare, long-term care, the ambulance services, and behavioral health. And that committee actually talks daily about what's going on in the region. So I really feel good about the communication right now happening both locally and what I'm getting from the state. And that took a little while to iron out in the first days of the COVID, especially on the Minnesota Department of Health side of things, and mostly because things were changing so quickly and the governor was putting things in very, very quickly. It was hard to keep up.
So I'm curious, since you, the closest ICU hospital is in Grand Forks, do you do any work with North Dakota, or how does that work?
So on a public health side, no, we really have two different public health agencies that operate. But because All True Health Systems serves a lot of Western Minnesota people, we have what's called the Northwest Healthcare Coalition, and they have representatives on that coalition. So monthly we get together with All True Health System emergency planning people, and have been for the last 3 years. So it's more on a health system. It's not necessarily, we're not crossing boundaries either on the emergency management side or on the public health side. And right now that seems to be working fine. The health systems are used to crossing boundaries, so they have that pattern already set.
Very cool. And I know you have obviously a huge background in public health, and I know that you serve on I think it's a state advisory committee or a state board. You end up in St. Paul quite often. I'm curious, if a pandemic, if anything like this has even been brought up. I mean, I know you said previously that, yeah, it's down the list, but what were you all talking about last month or 2 months ago?
Well, actually, since you asked, we were talking about what we call a full-scale exercise on the public health realm. So the money that CDC gives out to local public health culminates every 5 years with a statewide exercise. And so each 5 years, they kind of, or they don't kind of, they pick a theme. So the last 5 years, the theme was anthrax poisoning, recognizing that with terrorism and bioterrorism, that this could be a reality across the nation. And so we were ramping up for what we call medical countermeasures for anthrax, which is an antibiotic. So if you become poisoned with anthrax and you need an antibiotic within 48 hours to counteract the anthrax to be able to survive that anthrax poisoning. So those were all the plans that we were ramping up for and we've been working on for the last 3 years. Ironically, the next 5 years, we are going to start working on an influenza pandemic. So, so it was on the horizon. So like I said, it isn't something that nobody thought would ever happen. We know that we needed to plan and to solidify plans, but those plans ebb and flow. Like every 5 years, we get a new sort of thing to plan for. And anthrax actually was probably 7 years ago that we did the last one. So now it's to take those plans out again. And so we were getting ready to dust off the influenza pandemic plan. So that's what we were really gearing up for, was those medical countermeasures and getting them out to the general population, which really means how do you get out antibiotics across the state into a point of dispensing or a way to give it to the general public within 48 hours. So that was our task, and that's the full-scale exercise we were going to have was June 17th to do that. So obviously we're not going to have that full-scale exercise this year, but we're having real life response.
Yeah, well, looking forward to this next summer, of course, northwestern Minnesota, Roseau area, that's a big, tourism area. What are you planning, and what are just people in general up there planning for or anticipating or whatever for this spring when people would normally be heading north?
Actually, that has been a huge topic across the top third of the state, even before this point, because sheltering at home for a lot of people in metro areas meant, oh, what a great time to go and get away to our recreational resident up in northern Minnesota. And so those of us that live up here, we would not have the capacity if 500 to 1,000 extra people came into the county to utilize their deer camp or their lake home, and then ended up getting sick and needed hospitalization or health care. So last week, actually, Jan Malcolm, the Commissioner of Health, came out and said, sheltering at home means sheltering at your primary residence. Do not go up to northern Minnesota. They have low resource areas as it is. They're, gearing up to be able to take care of their own population. They do not have the capacity to take care of extra population. That being said, some counties had preempted already. Rainy River over in between International Falls actually and Vedette had closed their public access, because when there is still snow and ice across most of the lakes and Lake of the Woods, the river opens up right away and people can start fishing as early as April before the winter fishing ends and the spring fishing or summer fishing starts. So those counties, recognizing that they couldn't take care of that, we're already saying, no, you can't come up. We're not going to have an influx of people. So beyond that, everyone is cautiously optimistic that things will get back to normal by the time summer hits, because of course we are a big resort area in northern Minnesota across the whole state. And so they really do need to be able to have that opened up and flowing again for their livelihood, so that we don't have a cascading effect on the business communities that now include the resorts and all the people that make their living on those people that come north for vacations and recreation.
Again, you've worked on a statewide level on several things. What do you see as uniqueness about rural in this pandemic?
Honestly, I think it's that rural, we all know that we're in this together, and you'll see those ads running across the nation. Actually, we're all in this together. We're all in this together. We have seen that play out in the disasters that we've had in the last 25 years. Yes, rural is very isolated and geographically isolated. However, it doesn't matter if I need to help somebody over in Hallock in Kitson County or Badette. If they're calling for volunteers, people from Roseau County will go over and help them. So it isn't even necessarily that you're helping neighbor to neighbor. We're working across county lines, and we have worked across county lines. And so there is this underlying culture, or there is a culture where you just dig in and you help out, and you help out to the best of your ability. And so when I look at something like COVID, and I think over in North Dakota, they have similar problems as far as being very rural and not having ICU and maybe not having the healthcare. But their Center for Rural Health over there in Grand Forks came out with a statement that said, these people in rural, the healthcare facilities in rural, they don't know what they're going to do when they're overwhelmed, but they just know that they're going to be able to get it done. And I read that and thought, that's it exactly. We can have plans, and we do have plans, and we know that we're going to be overwhelmed, but we also know that neighbor to neighbor, we're going to do what needs to be done to get the whole community through it. And so there's a lot of looking outward at our neighbors and saying, how can we help, versus, trying to protect and just, make sure that our own needs are taken care of. And not that that doesn't happen elsewhere, I believe it does, but I just think because we are used to operating on our own for so long, being physically separated 6 hours from the Twin Cities, 3 hours to Fargo, and literally 2 hours if you want to go shopping at Target, we just are used to making do.
I think that points towards the blog post that we'll be posting, talking about rural resiliency. And I think that's just such a good point to put out there. Not that there's not resiliency in all of Minnesota, because there is. I think we're very good at that, but that rural resiliency really does shine through.
I believe it does. And then a point that I like to make about resiliency too, and I saw this, now 10 years after the flood and a couple other high water events, is that resiliency really means that you come through better than you were before. And so I see with COVID that there are going to be things in rural counties. Yes, we're going to have losses like we do with any natural disaster, but there will be improvements made, and rural will be better and stronger than it was before COVID.
That's great. I think that's just the perfect way of talking about resiliency. What advice do you have for residents in rural Minnesota as they're looking at this slow-moving tsunami coming towards them?
Oh gosh. I don't even know if I have advice for anyone on this, because I am an impatient person by nature. I want things to get resolved as soon as possible. And maybe that's why I like to be very planful, and why I sort of gravitate towards planning types of positions. But patience. Patience is the biggest thing. And to live one day at a time, week to week. And I see that playing out now across my area, and hopefully that's what other rural areas are doing as well. We will plan for the next deadline. If that deadline changes, then we'll pivot and we'll plan for the next one after that. So patience and just situational awareness, see what's going on around you.
So you're a new board member on the Center for Rural Policy and Development. And I'm just curious why you were interested in being on our board. We're very happy to have you and your background. But again, what interested you about being on this board?
Well, first of all, in my work as a grant writer previous to this in healthcare, I used your investigative reports all the time because Center for Rural Policy and Development was always out front in terms of rural issues and specifically to Minnesota issues. So you were giving the research to problems that I recognized but couldn't have had any background or research on. So I was able to look at your work and quote it within grants and other things and be able to say, here's why it's a problem. Here's why it's a problem here. And look, it's also being articulated across Minnesota by the Center for Rural Policy. So first of all, I was a big fan of your work. The other thing that really led me into public health and a master's degree is that in my work in northern Minnesota and working statewide on different things, I really saw a need to advocate for rural health in general. And so I went and got my master's in public health to give me opportunities to work in that sphere more than I could if I just were a resident of Roseau County who wanted to make sure that she always had good healthcare or healthcare across rural Minnesota. So it really was twofold in that advocacy and advocating for rural Minnesota has become my passion these last few years and going forward. So that's really why I was excited to be asked to be a board member. First of all, I was a big fan of all of your work, but second of all, it's just a great opportunity for me to help advance issues in rural Minnesota so that we get legislation that will more favorably deal with rural versus just blanket across the state. Here's what's good for all of you.
Great. Well, we're happy to have you on board.
Thank you.
And you're on our research committee too. So maybe the same question, why did you want to be on the research committee?
So that actually came out of work that I did with the hospital here in Roseau's Life Care Medical Center. About 7 or 8 years ago, there was a change in the way that they had to justify their nonprofit status. They had to formally go out and do a community health needs assessment. And so I was put in charge of that project the very first year they were required to do it. And so I, not knowing how to do it, went out and just started doing interviews with key stakeholders throughout the county. And what I found with that is that there were a lot of issues that came up that were related to healthcare and what we call social determinants of health that weren't really about healthcare delivery. And so that's a lot of the work that I see the Center for Rural Policy and Development doing, is finding and teasing out some of those issues before they're really on a national or even a statewide front. You're out ahead of that, you're getting the research before people even recognize that it's a problem. And so being able to be part of the research committee looking at those issues, I was really excited to be part of, because that's what I really foresee as a need for rural, is that we don't always look at the problems as to what the metro has, but we have to recognize that we have our own, and we need people that are out in the rural areas to be able to do that and to strategically look at what those things are that might affect rural Minnesota in general.
Sue, thanks so much for being on with us today.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate being able to tell the story up here in northern Minnesota. And so this has been very helpful to all of us that live up here next to Canada.
And thanks for joining us for episode 2 of the Center of Everywhere. You can find out more about rural Minnesota, the Center for Rural Policy and Development, and all our research at ruralmn.org.
You've been listening to the Center of Everywhere podcast, where we explore stories of rural Minnesotans who are making a difference in their communities. Rural isn't in the middle of nowhere, it is in the center of everywhere.